谢谢大家回谢北北时间，我们这个是 Pandemic Mini Series 的第3集，我们这次很高兴邀请到 Tom，讲这个澳洲的状况。然后，如果大家之前听过我们跟 Tom 讨论过那个脸书大战澳洲的那一集，我们是会用主要是英文在讨论，那这个就请大家多多包涵。那我们跟 Tom 的讨论是在4月26号那一天，就是也是有一阵子了，所以前几天我们请 Tom 给一个 update， 那这其实也是很有趣。那最后一件事情是因为大暑假在4月26号那天，他是这个非常忙的人，那天刚好我没记错好像有董事会。
是的，是的。
对，所以这个第一段主要是我大叔上跟 Tom 的讨论。那所以第一个就先请那个大叔甲，那个你有机会听一下我们跟 Tom 的讨论，那你有什么想法吗？
我觉得至少我自己啦，刚好我们上一次有谈到瑞典，然后这次又把澳洲拿进来，我觉得这2个前后这样子比较，我觉得挺有趣的，特别是他们对疫苗的施打的策略还蛮有趣，所以我想就是不管是 AZ 也好，或是Pfizer、BNT 也好，他们有不一样的策略，所以我觉得听众如果听了应该会觉得很有趣。
对，因为我觉得其实我们在这一系列有一个很重要的点，就是我们其实就是所谓的中型国家。那中型国家有种种的资源上的限制，所以其实多一点人试各种不同东西，然后互相学习，其实可能是一个比较走得通的路。那我想另外一件事情是也请大家听一下，就是因为瑞典它比较是一个极端，它是一直各种原因不想 lock down 这样子。那反之澳洲的整个 lock down 的过程，大家去听他们的描述，它是还蛮严谨的，甚至从我个人角度是变成是有一点没有人性的 lock down。
他感觉上他就比较是要用我们的语言，比较是所谓的硬封城，而且是好像就是也不进不出，对不对？
对，就是你澳洲人要出国是要有出国允许，然后偷偷出国是会被关监狱被罚钱。
哇哦，
对，
让我想到日本跟中国几百年前的禁海令，
没错
不准出国。
没
哇，
错。然后我想前一阵子大家可能也都听过，就是印度的那个病情比较严重的时候，他们是说澳洲政府是拒绝让很多在印度的澳洲公民回来，然后后来其实是有死人的，就是死在海外这样子。所以
有这个是新闻做的很大，我觉得从台湾的角度几乎是不可思议啦。
我想不止台湾，因为大部分的国家都会说，你就说别人就算自己的国民，这个其实是很难。可是我想，也真的很欢迎大家去听他们对于这个澳洲内部的这个思想是怎么看这件事情嘛。我想还是那句话，就是一个很世界很大，大家想法是很不一样的，都是民主国家，可是每个人的民主定义也是不一样的，所以
就是民主没有标准答案的。
没错。然后另外就是也很感谢很多听众对最近这几集有还蛮热烈私下跟我们的讨论。那第一个请大家如果愿意的话，在我们脸书上留言，我想你想得到的事情，很多人都会想到，或是你的问题，你想到问题，很多人会想到这样子。那所以像其中有一个 feedback 就是瑞典 Edward 就讲到瑞典最近是每一天有少于1000个人的新的 case， 然后大家都因为之前的关系，现在觉得非常欣慰，就说那瑞典我记得我没记错的话，大约瑞典目前大约是20% 的人已经打过疫苗了。
没错。
对，
然后这个1000个 case 就1000个确诊，这个每天的数字，如果把它往前看，就是6个月前他们是将近是7、8千一天，所以很明显的这个施打疫苗对于控制整个疫情是有非常正向的帮助。对，这时候大家就心中有点小小的希望了。
是，真的。那另外一个也是，就是比较是看数字的话，我刚才也查了一下美国它现在已经超过60%是大家至少有1针，然后年纪大的其实它的百分比是更高的。那美国现在每一天平均的因为 COVID 的死亡人数是大约400个人。那这个数字就是说，大家可能想到美国就美国嘛。那以美国人口3亿多，跟台湾2300万的话，也就是如果是把它这个数字平均起来，就是等于台湾每一天，有大约30到40个人因为 COVID 而过世。所以我觉得就是其实有很多 context。其实我觉得我们下次应该找个时间讲数字要怎么看。
是，不要被数字误导了。对，即使现在美国现状，我上次看好像现在还是一天12000到15000确诊的人数。那当然美国地方也很大啦，所以就是给大家一个数字的感觉哈，就是说一天15000，如果在台湾的话，等于是一天1000哦。所以我不是说谁做的比较好，或是谁做的比较不好，就是说大家对数字有个感觉，就是判断起来比较有衡量的标准。
是，对，这样就是所谓的 apple to apple， 不是，不然就哇，这个很难，这个数字的意思到底是什么？不过 anyway， 这个希望大家喜欢这个澳洲的这一集，至少我个人是学到很多很有趣的东西。那不过话又说回来，那个大叔甲最近还好吗？最近有没有什么这个新闻想要跟大家分享一下的？
这当然就是昨天大家都知道的，就是那个大家看到说美国昨天捐了250万剂的莫德纳疫苗，而且是昨天大概下午的时候抵达嘛，所以大家那个欢欣鼓舞一下，然后就是觉得跟当初他们说要给的75万剂的想法将近是多于3倍，所以大家还是觉得心中很安慰啦。那当然这种事情到最后还是要靠自己。那我觉得有点像是及时雨嘛，虽然没有解决所有的问题，但是大家可以喘一口气，至少心态上可以喘一口气。
是，就是一直有希望啦，就是想看怎么走。那我这边的话，其实我也是有点小感动，当然非常感谢美国送疫苗。那另外是我一个好朋友的儿子 Aaron，他前几天打电话给我，然后我跟 Aaron 是认识啦，可是其实因为是朋友的儿子，所以他打算跟我说，我想说 Aaron 谁？哪一个 Aaron？ 不过Aaron 是个高中生，然后呢，他就是虽然是很年轻的年轻人，可是他就是想要找大家来捐这个防护衣。所以就是他要捐给台大跟星光医院，那当然这种东西也很感谢 Aaron 邀请我来参加，所以我会捐一笔钱让这个大家同岛一命嘛。那这个2件事情，第一个，各位听众如果有兴趣的话，我们会把相关的资讯放在我们的脸书那个粉专上，然后那个想要找 Aaron 的，就请跟我们那个粉专上私讯。那不好意思，因为就是里面有一些比较银行相关的资料，我们当然是很明显不会把它放在我们的粉专上。那也希望大家多多的参与。我想这件事情有钱出钱，有力出力是应该的。然后说到有钱出钱，有力出力呢，就也顺便讲一下，因为前阵子大叔甲跟大叔长，我们有种种机会去做了一些演讲，然后拿了一 一些车马费，然后本来说实话，这个车马费是要拿来请我们的这个辛苦的工作团队，大家一起吃个饭。那当然，这个 officially 是因为最近因为 lockdown 嘛，就大家也不要团聚这样子，那所以钱就放在那边。那我想，就一些跟工作团队报备一下，这个钱呢，我先把它捐出去，就是以谢伯伯时间捐出来，然后给买防护衣。那所以接下来这个各位听众如果有兴趣的话，大叔甲跟大叔嫂呢都还是很愿意这个出来演讲，做一些不管是公益还是分享一些有趣的经验，所以这个有兴趣的话，你还是可以这个让我们知道，我们也希望能够在各种方面做一些小小的贡献。好，那最后在我们进入这个节目之前，还是那句话。你会听到这里就是有言之有物的人，所以不要忘记要订阅、打星星、按赞、留言，然后推荐至少2个朋友，一定要订阅、打星星、按赞跟留言。
是的，然后在这段疫情的时候呢，真的大家要好好照顾自己。如果行有余力呢，也要把身边的亲朋好友照顾好。
对，谢谢大家。好，那我们现在进入 program。谢谢大家回来听我们的节目。我们今天特别找 Tom 来 ，Tom 当然是个好朋友，然后他是在澳洲出生。然后他现在是住在台湾，那就像我们之前提到的，我们对于就是非美国、非中国的这个疫情状况，每个国家怎么处理，就是觉得很有趣，所以我们今天特别请 Tom 来跟大家分享一下在澳洲的一些经验。因为其实澳洲的人口跟经济体系跟台湾 size 还蛮类似的，所以是有没有什么大家可以互相学习，或者是就了解一下。So, okay, Tom, thank you for coming. Really appreciate this. So I think a lot of things has happened, and we sort of want to cover 2 specific areas. One is obviously your hometown is in Melbourne, and there's been quite a bit of story coming from Melbourne, including several lockdowns. But at the sort of a state federal level, there's the travel ban, and there's been discussion of travel bubbles with New Zealand. So we'd very much like to kind of get your perspective on what's going on, because frankly, just sheer out of laziness, I don't follow Australian news that closely.
It's very far away.
And indeed. I think what everybody really cares about these days is sort of the vaccine status and who is taking the vaccine and what's going on. I do remember you do share a picture where, in the clinic there is 1 vial of, vaccine. That was pretty fascinating. So, Tom, please, so what happened?
Absolutely. So the chronology of the COVID situation in Australia is quite interesting, because the government response was early and quite rapid. Australia, of course, has many residents with family members in Wuhan, and so the first case came in from Wuhan, and they shut the border to China on the 1st of February. And that was followed up by a full international border closure on March 22nd. This is in 2020, which was only a couple of days after Taiwan, which is renowned as the world's best practice. At that time that the borders were closing, we were looking at around 350 cases a day, which is quite significant considering here we are in Taiwan. I think we maxed out at 20 cases a day in the very early part of the pandemic, and then very quickly went to 0. And around the same time, we started seeing the first lockdowns. So from March to April, there was a lockdown in Victoria. And later on, in the middle of last year, between July and October, the state of Victoria was locked down for 111 days.
Continuously?
Continuously.
Goodness.
Indeed. So that's quite a few months. And the peak case rate in Australia was in excess of 700 per day.
Wow.
So Australia's COVID story is a little bit different to where we are in Taiwan, but there's some interesting commentary that can be had on part of the response. So, for instance, almost a quarter, or maybe even a little bit more than a quarter of all COVID cases in Australia are due to messing up the hotel quarantine system. So from the time that the international border shut, if you were able to get back to Australia on one of the few remaining international flights, you had to go to a government-designated quarantine hotel. And in Australia, it's a federation of states. There are 6 different states and a couple of territories. And interestingly, the federal government decided that it would be up to the states to manage their own quarantine programs. In all of the states, bar one, they asked the local police to be a strong part of enforcing the hotel quarantine. But in Victoria, which is the state where Melbourne is the capital, they got private security contractors to be heavily involved in making sure that these people under quarantine actually stayed in quarantine. And I don't know how familiar you are with private security contractors, but it's not uncommon as a private security contractor to work multiple jobs. And so we saw cases where a security contractor would work in the quarantine hotel during the day and then deliver pizzas at night, not knowing, of course, that they were COVID positive and sharing all of that disease around.
Right.
We also heard some more mischievous stories about the hotel quarantine system, such as romance being found between the staff and patients under quarantine, and this also leading to additional spread. So healthy people were going into hotel quarantine and coming out sick.
Wait, so after the quarantine, they don't test them, or how does that work?
Right, so testing was actually pretty well done. So they were able to determine that these people had COVID, but the fact is that they went into hotel quarantine healthy and caught it in the facility that's supposed to isolate everyone and prevent the spread of cases.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was a pretty interesting debacle, and that's led to several investigations and inquiry, and it wasn't even limited to Melbourne. There've actually been issues with hotel quarantine in other states, even as recent as last week. The state of Western Australia had a few cases of local transmission because of a poorly designed ventilation system in a quarantine hotel. Yes, it was quite interesting to see the federal government become something of an armchair critic there, given it hasn't really played a big role in the COVID quarantine in Australia and criticizing the government there.
I think this is an area that I don't know enough about, but just kind of, looking at the U.S. model, right? It's all federal government and states. So it sounded like at the state level in Australia, people are doing their own things.
That's true.
So how do they coordinate if they don't? Like, for example, in the U.S., people are asked to quarantine. Whether or not they do, that's a different thing. And then, how do you prevent or control the flow between states in Australia?
Definitely. I think this is one of the most interesting topics about the COVID response in Australia, because different states are doing different things, and the coordination between states and between the federal government isn't always smooth. For instance, to the absolute annoyance of many Australian residents, various state borders went up and down like yo-yos. You really had to think about, if you were living in one state and you wanted to go and visit relatives in another state, could you get there, have your holiday and come back before the border shut again, because different states were criticizing each other's responses to COVID and saying, you're doing something too risky, I'm not going to allow you to come in. And there were several cases where the announcements went out in the afternoon, okay, border is shutting at midnight. If you're not in by then...
Also, you literally have hours.
That's right.
To react.
And this led to some very amusing situations where people were trying to drive through the middle of the desert and getting stuck and calling for rescue. And
God.
This is actually something that is implementable in Australia, unlike, I think, in the US, because Australia is very sparsely populated, and the roads that cross the border are few and far between. So you put some police on the border, and you can generally keep people out if you need to.
Wow.
But it definitely annoyed people to no end. However, when things went badly, particularly in Victoria, the federal government did step up and offer the services of the armed forces. So for example, even my younger brother, who was a medic in the Navy, spent a couple of weeks in Melbourne just swabbing people for COVID tests. But something really interesting happened as well. Because there were so many COVID cases, people who were tested positive for COVID, they didn't necessarily have a negative pressure isolation ward to put them in. They were just told, stay home, you're not allowed to leave.
Right.
And the government kind of came to the conclusion that people might not be following that instruction. And so at one point they sent the army around knocking on people's doors. And in the state of Victoria, they actually found more than a quarter of people were not at home.
So one in four.
That's right. And some fascinating stories from the people doing those door knocks. So, for instance, one door knock happened, and the target patient's relative was there, and so was asked, "Oh, where such and such?" Was checking. She says, "Nah, she's gone to work, mate." And so this is someone who's had a positive COVID test. They're known to be infectious. They're known to have symptoms. Going to work, even though they've been told to stay at home.
So this is early on during the pandemic, or it was later on, because there seemed to be a change from awareness, and I think when it got started, a lot of people think of this as sort of a more severe case of a flu.
That's right, and I think even the early information that came out in Australia is, face masks don't do anything. They stop being effective after 15 minutes anyway. And it was some surgeons that said that, people believed it. But I think that one of the real drivers of some of these early cases is the general Australian population's relationship with the government, and the amount of trust they place in the government to look after them. I'd say that in general Australians are quite skeptical of government policy, and this goes back a couple hundred years, of course, talking about things like during the gold rush era, the Eureka Stockade, which was a famous uprising against a government policy. So sticking it to the man is a thing in Australia as much as anywhere, possibly even more.
So that was when it got started, and there's a fair amount of confusion. And I think, in fairness, it's not only in Australia, right? And I think it's worldwide.
Definitely.
But are people more? I don't want to use the word cooperative, but just like, it's like, okay, what if I am positive, or this is not just me, or are people still trying to get around it, or just mostly drinking booze?
Well, I can confirm that alcohol sales did increase significantly. My own parents took advantage of an offer from Qantas, the Australian airline, who were offloading some of their wine stock. So they bought a crate full of those little mini bottles of wine that you get on planes, and worked their way through those. But yeah, you can see with some of the clusters that have come out just how uncooperative people can be, and things like the massive beach parties that happened the instant that lockdown restrictions were relaxed slightly, of course then causing lockdown restrictions to be reinstated more severe than before. And I think though that the blame has to be shared. So there were also clusters where even in March, a cruise ship just turned up and were kind of waved through, and that ended up, I think, contributing 500 cases. Well, just 500 positive cases of the ship passengers alone, but that would have resulted in much more community transmission. So I think the conflagration, the kind of conjunction of people's general attitude towards the government telling them to do something, the fact that the policies were not universally implemented between states and maybe even a little bit confusing in their restrictions. So, for example, to understand the lockdown restrictions, you probably had to read, 3 or 4 pages of information to work out where exactly can you go to the shops at which time and these kinds of things. That's resulted in the case that we have today. But I think now that we have had a situation where, for example, Melbourne was in lockdown for 111 days, people get it. And they're much more cooperative. People now on social media, instead of venting their frustration about being locked in their small space and missing out on their sport and outdoor activity, which is a massive part of Australian culture and lifestyle, they're celebrating things like donut days, where there were no community cases.
Yes, I remember in Taiwan for a while, like everybody looking in the Yuanshan Fandian, to see what's the number.
Indeed.
But I think it's one of the things that we were just talking about with Tom, that I know of sort of the national lockdown to international travel, but Tom, can you explain a little bit more about how it works, because apparently this is not a federal level thing.
Yeah, that's true. So there is a federal level policy which says Australians are not allowed to go overseas. So Australians are stuck inside the country, and that's been the case since March last year. And the inbound restrictions, essentially, you'd expect that as an Australian citizen, you could get back into the country just using your passport, right?
Right.
No longer the case because of these restrictions. So there is a weekly limit on the number of people that can get back into Australia. And consistently, actually, there've been more than 40,000 Australians stranded overseas, unable to get back into Australia.
So how many is allowed every week, approximately?
So it changes depending on which states are open, because of course the state borders are going up and down like yo-yos, and the international airports are shutting and opening at the drop of a hat. But generally it's ranged from between a couple thousand to, I think at peak, 8,000 people per week across all international ports in Australia. Sydney being the prime international flight connection hub, and that's where most people would come in. But the interesting thing is those numbers are not set by the federal government.
Goodness.
They're set by the states.
Oh my God.
So the states kind of have a look at their quarantine hotel system and go, I reckon we can take a couple hundred people. And then they'll tell the federal government, and the federal government will publish it on their website and tell the airlines, you're only allowed to have 200 people this week.
Okay, so this is absolutely fascinating, because if it's being adjusted, let's say on a weekly basis, give or take, then that means that if I finally have permission to travel back to Australia in 3 weeks' time, it is possible that when my flight is about to depart, say, oops, sorry, you kind of didn't make the list. Not so much you don't have the right paperwork, but now instead of 1,000, it's only 500, and you're the unlucky 500.
And so there are stories about people turning up to the airport more than 10 times to get on a flight that was cancelled or they were kicked off. Because, of course, with the constant changes, airlines have to respond to ensure their commercial viability.
Sure.
And so many airlines have responded by just saying, for instance, we're basically going to go business class only. And so if you're in the far-flung reaches of the world trying to get back to Australia...
you have to pay like triple than your typical.
Exactly, if not more. And so credit to the airlines who have kept the international routes going into Australia. But it's very difficult to get a ticket, and if you really want to get a ticket, you're going to pay through the nose for it. So
my goodness.
I looked up trying to get a ticket from Taiwan to Australia, which normally you can find one for, $1,000 to $1,500 US dollars. But now you're looking at $5,000 US dollars if you want to get back within a reasonable time frame. Of course, if you have something which means you need to get back today or next week, that's just not possible.
Right. Well, you need to get a permit first.
Yeah. And even if you can get that ticket, there's no guarantee the flight will actually run. So it's a massive issue for a large number of people.
Right.
That's not to say that the government hasn't been running rescue flights every now and again when there's a significant enough group of Australians in places around the world. But
Right.
if you talk about what happened before March, in February, you kind of got a few government advertisements saying, if you're overseas, come back now. And then bang, borders shut. You've had your chance.
Wow, that's but with that said, I mean, because now everybody talking about different travel bubble between, say, Hong Kong and Singapore, and now there's Taiwan and Palau, and so I heard there's attempts at travel bubble between New Zealand and Australia, and then what happened?
That's right. So the first attempt was actually in October last year. The Australian government allowed New Zealanders to come to Australia without quarantine. New Zealand, of course, being a country which has had very small numbers of cases, if not zero, for many, many months now. And but it wasn't reciprocal. At that time, Australia was still having a reasonable caseload, and so it was a one-way travel bubble.
You cannot come.
But even so, there are a large number of New Zealanders who live in Australia, and the ability for them to get back to where they live was a big boon. But it didn't last.
So the first time, if you live in New Zealand, you can go to Australia. However, if you live in Australia, even if you're New Zealand nationals, you cannot return to New Zealand. Is that what happened?
I believe if you're a New Zealand national, you could go back to New Zealand, but you'd have to quarantine.
Sure.
However, as an Australian national, you are not allowed to travel internationally. That is an interesting point, which we can touch more on later. But that travel bubble was cancelled almost immediately because New Zealand had a paltry 3 cases caused by a pilot or something.
Yes.
And it wasn't immediately, sorry, that lasted until January.
So that's the first.
That was the first
bubble
attempt,
opening,
asynchronous, indeed. So the second bubble was inflated in just a week ago on the 19th of April, and that was a fully reciprocal travel bubble, so quarantine-free between Australia and New Zealand. And for that week, the media was full of these tear-jerking stories about family reunions and people seeing loved ones that they hadn't seen for a year. It was amazing. And then there were a few cases in Western Australia last week due to a quarantine hotel, as mentioned, and then New Zealand said, nope. And you don't blame them, because Australia was quite vindictive for doing the same thing earlier on. But one other interesting thing, because Australians are not allowed to travel overseas, it's banned and there are massive fines. Some Australians in the past week have figured out if they can get to New Zealand, New Zealand's not going to stop them traveling to a third country.
Oh, good point.
And so recently the federal government in Australia have tried enacting some new regulations to fine those people massive amounts.
But how would they know?
I don't know. The Australian government is omnipotent and all-seeing.
That way,
so,
right? I see.
Yeah. So that's been interesting, that they've taken proactive action against that again.
Right. Yeah. Well, so on that point, though, that's first of all, is absolutely fascinating. But so the idea would be, let's say from Sydney, I fly to Auckland in New Zealand, and then assuming there's a flight, and go to Tokyo, for example.
Indeed.
And then, but I think to me the calculation is that I may not be able to get back because the second bubble collapsed already.
Yes, though, but if you happen to live and work in Japan,
you just want to get to Japan, not necessarily to come back.
That's right.
Because you probably wouldn't have the permit to come back regardless.
Yeah.
I see. And then so in that case, people really trying to exit. Then what can the Australian government do?
I'm not sure, but well, I think that the travel restrictions are an ongoing topic of discussion, particularly in light of the vaccine program.
Right. Yeah. So how's the vaccine rollout these days?
I believe the media used the word bungled. So we had some interesting early steps in Australia. So I believe that Australia holds the dubious honour of being the only nation to have its vaccine export banned from the European Union.
Italy, I remember.
Indeed, a couple 100,000 doses.
Wait, what did Australia do to Italy that they decided to ban Australia?
I'm not sure. The only theory I heard was it was something related with Brexit and the Commonwealth. But that's completely speculation.
Well, Australia does start with A, so they started from the top of the list.
Indeed. So Australia has ordered, hundreds of thousands of AstraZeneca vaccines directly from AstraZeneca, obviously through their distribution channels in the EU. They've also ordered 50 million Novavax vaccines and 20 million Pfizer vaccines. But the big hope for Australia is the local friendly pharmaceutical giant CSL is going to manufacture 50 million of the AstraZeneca vaccine.
Right.
And they're aiming to produce around 1 million of those a week, starting in March. However, last I checked, we're past March and that hasn't happened yet. So,
it takes time. Time. Let's do,
As of today, only 700,000 vaccines have been rolled out. And
so there is currently no known indigenous production capability right now.
It's still ramping up. Australia did have an attempt to create its own vaccine. At the University of Queensland, and it looked like they had a good vaccine going. It was responding very well. However, they discovered a very unfortunate side effect of that vaccine, which is the test used to determine positivity for HIV was triggered by that vaccine.
So
goodness!
So
the vaccine was not giving people HIV, but forever you would do that test. As a result, they abandoned that vaccine because obviously that's not viable.
Right.
But the vaccine.
So how many physical dosage are there? Because there's no current local capacity to produce, so it all has to be imported. And so like we're talking about like 1 million, 10 million. How many?
It's not clear, but it would be closer to 1 million.
And then the population of Australia is
25 million.
25 million.
Give or take.
Okay. And then so that means the 1 million dosage are all taken up because only 4% of people are eligible. So surely it's all used up.
Well, there were some distribution problems. So initially, the federal government decided to step up and coordinate the vaccine rollout program centrally, and they made this website where you could book your appointment online.
Sounds good.
It's great in theory. Unfortunately, it seems like the communication with all of the disparate vaccination clinics was not effective.
Oh goodness!
And so there were massive problems with ordering, with getting apartments, with people turning up and forming queues at clinics. And keep in mind, this is just for the first phases of vaccination. It's just for essential workers and the elderly.
Right.
And so recently, I believe that that responsibility was delegated back to the state level.
Oh, goodness. Okay. Yeah. And then in Australia, there's also the national health care.
That's right. Australia has, like all developed nations, apart from the US, Australia has single-payer.
Right, and that's right at the federal level, right?
That's right. Yeah, it's a very good program. Very effective.
Yeah. So it's not so much. Or I'm speculating here. I mean, it's probably not a communication issue in a sense that the French government should have a way to contacting all the care provider. However, the actual physical logistics of storing, transporting, and how to administer the shots.
Potentially. I mean, we know that the AstraZeneca vaccine requires really good cold chain.
Yes.
And we have seen. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought.
Oh no, that's all right. I think and are people like actively taking up the opportunity to get a shot, or maybe the case is so low in Australia, people say, well, let's wait.
Indeed, I think that because of the news about the blood clots in relation to the AstraZeneca vaccine, that has dampened enthusiasm for the vaccine take-up. Right. I don't have any specific numbers off the top of my head, but my impression is, just talking anecdotally with friends and family, is there's still a prevailing opinion that the best vaccine you can get is the one that you can get.
Yes.
Having said that, the government recently enacted a policy which said, okay, for anyone under 50, we're going to not give you the AstraZeneca vaccine because of that clotting risk.
Right.
At least until it's investigated. But my father's been vaccinated, and he said he was feeling like he had a strong cold for about a day, but otherwise is fine.
Okay.
I personally have booked an appointment for next Thursday. So
excellent. If
you can get the vaccine, I highly recommend it.
Right. Wow. This is fascinating because, again, Australia, at least from the Taiwan's perspective, it's very, very close, and it's a sort of important neighbor. But for any number of reasons, we just don't hear a lot about Australia. It's if you really want, obviously, there's always channels to look for, and it's absolutely fascinating to hear what happens, in terms of the Melbourne experience, and I find the sort of the overseas travel restriction especially interesting. I mean, I have heard commentators saying that Australia has taken a very extreme form of control, because usually if you're a national, it's really hard to refuse entry. So I mean, I think my final question is, I mean, how, and this is obviously speculative, but from what you can see, how has this experience changed Australia? And this in the context of, I think a lot of people are saying in Taiwan, because of the SARS experience, people are much more aware, and so do you think, what would be, the Australian experience based on what you've seen so far?
Definitely. So I think that first, acknowledging the more than 900 people who've died of COVID in Australia, because I think that regardless of the potential improvements and learnings, we have to remember that there are people that have lost their lives while we were learning those things, and all the impact on those family members. But I think that the parallel between Taiwan's SARS experience is an apt one. I think that now we can say that Australia knows how to run a mass quarantine facility.
It takes practice,
Right, definitely. And that's something where you'd hope that after all of the frantic rush to set it up has subsided, someone will sit down and go, okay, let's document this. Here's the standard operating procedure for that. I think if you look at the coordination between different government agencies and between the federal and state, even local level, I think Taiwan had learnings there as well, and I think that Australia would definitely be wise to look at all of the experiences and work out how to coordinate in times of crisis. And no doubt they have and they will. There are several inquiries about the handling of various things, like the cruise ship that came long after Taiwan had banned cruise ships coming in, and the
hotel romances. I
Hotel
always
romances.
find that fascinating.
Definitely. Or indeed just the people who went to work with this very infectious disease, had full knowledge of it. So I think that Australia is well set up structurally to take all of those learnings and turn it into a Taiwan level response in the future.
Right. Wow. Absolutely fascinating. Again, so thanks to Tom for sharing these experiences. Let's keep the conversation going. Okay. Thank you, Tom.
Hi, this is Tom from the future, bringing you a little addendum update to our podcast. We recorded in mid-April. It's now mid-June, and some interesting things have happened since then. One of the biggest newsworthy incidents in the recent pandemic is the situation in India, of course. Starting shortly after we recorded our podcast, the situation there became quite dire, and we've all seen the news about the lack of oxygen and the mass deaths. As of the 3rd of May, about 8,000 to 9,000 Australian citizens were still in India, and a non-trivial number of those had actually travelled there to rescue parents or older relatives and bring them back to Australia, given that it was deemed safer. But in late April, what happened is the Australian government cancelled all international flights inbound from India, but they did not consider that approach sufficient and took a further step, which was met with public outrage. They decided to try and stop people escaping from India via third countries by banning Australian citizens from coming back to Australia, with fear of 5 years of jail time or up to $50,000 in fines if they did so. The argument from the government is that at that time, fully 57% of cases in quarantine in Australia had originated in India, but this did not appear to quell the public. On May 15th, in response, the Australian government organised the first rescue flight, which appeared to be very hastily organised and departed half empty. And the stories started emerging, for example, of one businessman and father of two who was in India and had his flight cancelled by the government because of the extended time he was in India, which he contracted COVID and later died. And so in the media, various people, including the man's daughter, asking whether the government has blood on its hands. So that was an interesting addendum to the Australian government's approach to managing borders during COVID-19. At the moment, the leadership is saying that borders are likely to remain shut, not just for travellers from India, but from all countries, until mid-2022. In positive news, Australia's vaccination rollout is underway after some early foibles. So you'll remember that the cornerstone of the program was local manufacturing of the AstraZeneca vaccine. Australian biomedical giant CSL was going to manufacture 50 million doses, which they started in November 2020. And those doses are starting to be used now. Australia, of course, also booked in 10 million Pfizer doses, which were supposed to come from the EU, which subsequently banned their export, as well as 25 million Moderna and 51 million Novavax. As we sit today, as of the 16th of June, 795,000 people in Australia have been fully vaccinated, about 3% of the population, and more than 20% have received their first dose. At the moment, the priority-ranked vaccination system is working, and those who are 50 years old or more, or working in a particular industry, frontline medical workers and so forth, are eligible for vaccination. One interesting difference in Australia compared with some other countries is medical advice was received that the AstraZeneca vaccine should not be used for those aged above 50. So those above 50 are currently getting the Pfizer vaccine, and anyone below that age is currently getting the AstraZeneca unless there's another reason for it. So all the best to Australia, and good luck getting those vaccinations done.
非常谢谢大家听这个 Tom 跟我们分享澳洲的经验，我真的学到蛮多东西的。不过真的不过这个最后呢，还是要谢谢我们这个厉害的这个制作团队。那第一个要感谢的是阿贤，就是我们之前说叫他 Josh 那个阿贤写的音乐，非常谢谢他。
我们要感谢我们自己的制作团队 Ariel、Hannah、Lalisa、Tiffany 跟 Oliver。
对，然后那我们下一集就是第4集这个 mini series 的最后一集是要讨论从一个台湾的角度，我想我们一直讲就是台湾就所谓的中型国家 middle power。那在这件事情上 middle power 有什么可以做，有什么不能做的？那我们之前就是我们讨论了瑞典，讨论了澳洲，那从台湾有什么可以做的事情呢？
所以我们要做个总结吗？是这个意思吗？
总结说不上啦，这个事情就是一直在发生的。可是我想就是这个中文不是说3个臭皮匠嘛，胜过1个诸葛亮。我们从各种地方看，然后其实有很多事情我们也已经别人在发生过的事情，我们真的还蛮多可以借鉴的啦。说实话，
真的，我自己也很期待。
对，那所以最后这个还是提醒大家，你都已经听到这里了，我们连 ending credit 都在听的人，还是要订阅、打星星、按赞、留言，然后逼你这个至少3个朋友要按赞、打星星、订阅，然后留言。是，那我们最后也感谢我们这个听众吉尔，跟我们跟所有大家讲几句鼓励大家，我们一起防疫。
我是吉尔，请你照顾自家，喺工作嘅地，未请照顾朋友。